Organization of race relations that occurred roughly between 1890 and 1915, or you could say 1885 and 1915, we have a very different situation. The dominant group in U.S. society, those who deemed themselves white, actively restricted, went out of the way to restrict the lives of blacks, of Mexicans, of Asians, and of Native Americans, in what I think of as a strategy for confronting unpredictability in the market by shifting the economic burdens onto others that you've been taught already were your inferiors, and to limit the possibilities, to negate the possibilities that people of color could in some way, their preferences could in some way affect the outcome of contests between white people that are very closely fought. So, which is one of the reasons why I started with this slide, from which is a racist slide, from dealing with the result of the 1876 election, which, if you don't know, in 1876, the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden, a governor of New York, won the election. He won the popular vote, and he should have won the Electoral College vote, but Republicans stole the election in Florida and one other southern state by suppressing white southern votes and getting there to be extra black votes. So in the corruption was a normal part of the U.S. electoral process, so this was not anything new per se, but you had a very tight election nationally, and in several of the southern states the result was very close, and that then led to a national furor, particularly from the Democratic Party, who had after all been cheated of the election, that not only chicanery and corruption had been involved, but black voters had stolen the election from the will of the majority, and began a series of advertisements to try to and propaganda efforts to try to convince the broader American public, white American public, that the black franchise was a danger to the democratic process because black voters were supposedly more manipulable by the Republican Party and more susceptible to corruption. And I'm laying this out because I think it actually provides a clue, an important clue to the development of the racial system in the United States, and particularly to Jim Crow. That it developed as there were highly contested fights between populist farmers and the political interest defending the rising corporation in the 1880s and 1890s, in the states where the black vote could determine the outcome, there were efforts to begin to limit the black vote. This is another cartoon related to this effort to blame the black suffrage for the problems with the American electoral system, and to equate black suffrage with corruption and stealing of elections. The end result of this was Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, his people negotiated a deal with the Democratic Party, particularly in the South, where they accepted the formal returns instead of challenging them, particularly in Florida, and thus Hayes would win the election in the Electoral College, but he agreed to remove federal troops from the South. They had been in the South since 1866, essentially guaranteeing the peace and civil order. And with the removal of the troops, then becomes a massive civil war, if we want to call it that, in which white vigilantes, the Ku Klux Klan among them, but not only, are bound and determined to chase out the Reconstruction-era governments and to prevent, in particular, to prevent black candidates from running for office. Initially, and in the process, what emerges is what's called the Bourbon Restoration, which I suppose was a reference to the restoration of the Bourbon dynasty in France after the fall of Napoleon. So the radicals, the radical Reconstructionists, were pushed out of office. The old line Southern politicians returned to power, and but they did not immediately set about to disenfranchise black voters. As long as black voters did not organize as an independent force within southern states, they were allowed to continue voting, and they were allowed to continue in their lives. And indeed, the Bourbon Restoration governors claimed that they were governing on the behalf of everybody. That is the political context for Jim Crow, I think, but that's the first part of it. There's also an economic incentive for the development of a new structure for race, an economic incentive which actually is probably even more the case in the North, the Midwest, and the Far West. That is, given the connection between employment, housing, and ethnicity, if there's one group that is more vulnerable to violence than another, groups that want to push ahead and take over job categories are going to, might decide to pick on black workers in New York rather than, say, Swedish workers. And indeed, a study by the state of New York in 1912 found that of the 160 occupations that African Americans had done in that state in 1880, by the time of the report, blacks had been pushed out of 113 of them. So in 1880, there were approximately 160 types of jobs that African Americans typically did in the state of New York. By 1912, that had been reduced to 30-something, right? Yes, 30-something, 37. And the report documented campaigns by white workers uniting to push blacks out of jobs that had previously been done by them. The best example would be barbering and hairstyling. These were two skilled occupations, largely done by black Americans. It was a service position and therefore consistent with the earlier ideology that the social position of people of color was that of service. But nonetheless, it was a well-paying, skilled job. So there was an active campaign to prevent blacks from serving as barbers or hairstylists to whites. Similarly, blacks had formed a majority of the professional wait staff at hotels and expensive restaurants. But the restaurant unions began to campaign to have black workers, black wait staff, replaced by whites. In this case, and in both in the Barber campaign as well, this is one of the first important steps of kind of a pan-white identity, because it didn't really, as far as the union campaigners were concerned, it didn't matter what ethnicity the replacements were so long as they were white. And in that case, when you have people occupying relatively well-paying and secure jobs being pushed out and replaced by another group, you have a clear transfer of wealth and security from that first group to the second group. This was a campaign that included violence, the intimidation of black workers and their employers or their clients, as well as deepening the exclusions from membership in the relevant union. So that people who wanted to support union work because they were a member of, say, the machinists' union, wound up by default boycotting places where blacks worked because they were being picketed by the the barbers' union or by the restaurant workers' union. I pinpoint the machinists' union because officially they were opposed to all forms of racial discrimination. But they were probably for them a higher goal was the question of union solidarity. If you wanted your strikes supported by the barbers and the restaurant workers, you needed to support those unions. The Irish were key to pushing both black and Chinese workers out of the fields that they had occupied. In large part, this was, if the Irish had a disproportionate role in this, it is probably due to the fact that many of the Irish, particularly the Irish men who came to the United States, came having been participants in the movement against British imperialism, British colonialism in Ireland. They had military training. They had developed a political style of needing to do whatever you had to win your battles. And they also came to the United States largely embittered and angry because of the conditions in Ireland. Norwegians and Finns were two other groups that came to the United States with particularly strong traditions of militant opposition to the Swedish and Russian governments, and just transferred that to that militancy to the opposition that they faced. So, but I think the first national piece, the first national effort to develop a formal color line did not actually happen, did not concern the position of African Americans, but focused on the position of Chinese immigrants in the United States. Which was, particularly in the West Coast, had become a major political issue. The Democratic Party, as a party of the white working class, had taken the position that all immigrants of color should be excluded, so only immigrants who were white would be let into the country. The Republican Party had long had a position of opposition to any kind of racial exclusions. But in 1882, the person on the left, James G. Blaine, who had been Secretary of State, Speaker of the House, and U.S. Senator from Maine, was running for the presidency in what looked like was going to be a very tight election. He was Irish American, and he thought he had a chance at getting some Irish American votes if he came out in favor of Chinese exclusion. So he announced